Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, we've covered the horrific story about a pregnant 10-year-old rape victim twice on Rising this week. First, to question if the original Indy Star report was a hoax, then to concede it appeared to be very real. So why bring it up a third time? Well, first, we continue to get new information on the story. Second, it illustrates precisely why the media can never, ever punt on corroborating single source stories, period. I said right here yesterday that I've been wrong before and I will surely be wrong again. That much I can promise. Thankfully, nothing I said on our first story was factually incorrect, but my suggestion that bad reporting in this case meant the story was likely false turned out to be wrong. I did say the doctor heard about the girl's story secondhand, which we now know is not true because we know she later performed the abortion herself, although that wasn't clear from the original piece, which just said the girl went to her for, quote, care. But when we went to air, here's what we knew. The story had a single source. Every major city in Ohio told the Washington Post they had no record of this, and reporting would be mandatory because of their laws. The Ohio Attorney General said he had no record of this. The Indy Star would not say if it even contacted law enforcement. We still don't know if that's true, and the original story still has no comment or no indication that comment was sought from law enforcement, which is highly unusual for a story like this. There's just no way around it. That is reckless journalism, and it needs to be called out precisely to avoid this truly awful cycle we're stuck in right now. It's always been true that this girl's story is plausible. Sadly, the reporting needed to be questioned. It needed to be, because it was so flawed, which opened up a hyper-partisan debate over whether this particular incident was real, meaning the tragedy turned into a football that distracted from the real question of whether the story represents a broader reality. Now, unlike some others here on Rising, we were clear from the very beginning whether the story is true. It does, in fact, represent a broader reality. In 2020, 52 girls under the age of 15 or 15 and under received abortions in Ohio. In the preceding years, that number was even higher. Red state anti-abortion laws in the post-Roe world will confront these horrific cases. There is no question about it. But again, here's where the Indy Star is reporting did everyone a serious disservice. In Ohio, a pregnant 10-year-old would almost certainly qualify for a medical exemption to their abortion law, meaning the girl would not have had to cross state lines into Indiana. That was the whole point of the story in the Indy Star, but that was not mentioned or addressed. Now, we actually still don't know if that's what happened in this case. We also don't know if she was, quote, forced to go to Indiana for the abortion, as President Biden said, and the Indy Star story implied. Ohio law is ambiguous on that question, although the Attorney General did say a 10-year-old would likely qualify, but litigating that during a pregnancy is enormously difficult because time is obviously of the essence for people's health. But the fact remains, we don't actually know the story actually reflected on problems with Ohio's law, which was what the Indy Star implied. Now, I happen to be against abortion, and I happen to believe this is a hard truth other people against abortion, lawmakers in particular, need to confront clearly and need to deal with. Pregnancies in young girls almost certainly medically endanger their lives, so the law should be crystal clear on what's legal if that's the case. And on top of that, the right shouldn't pretend as though these cases aren't going to happen. They absolutely are. They are real. In another strange turn of events yesterday, it should also be noted that the girl's mother told Telemundo in a very bizarre interview that, quote, everything they're saying against him, the man who has apparently confessed to this, is a lie. Now, in reference to that man, who again, law enforcement says has actually confessed to these heinous crimes against her daughter, that's really hard to believe. But the one thing we do know about him is that he's an undocumented immigrant. But you wouldn't actually know that if you read the update in Reuters and NBC News and ABC News, at least as of last night. That's hardly the most important aspect of this case. Research suggests illegal immigrants commit violent crimes at a lower rate than American citizens, although it's very difficult to screen for people's criminal pasts when they're coming in without any screening. But it's obviously a relevant and newsworthy fact about the man who, again, has confessed to this crime. The media's omission of that fact doesn't excuse calling the original story a lie, like Jim Jordan did, fanciful, like the Wall Street Journal editorial board did, or even assuming it was likely untrue, like I did. But it does underscore why this horrible story is an important example of media failure. Trust in media is at record low levels, and sadly, that is exactly where it should be. Publishing explosive stories based on one person with zero input from law enforcement or any additional corroboration is why so many legacy media stories ultimately do actually turn out to be false. Local media has been gutted by the Facebook era, and they're short on resources. The size of the media in general shrunk dramatically, and that happened very fast, and the industry hasn't recovered from losing all of these additional layers of editorial oversight, fact-checking, and more. Plus, reporters are now more ideological and more comfortable letting their ideological leanings direct their reporting. That's how they end up relying on one source and using language that plays a little bit fast and loose. It's true, media critics get things wrong. Of course that's true. But nobody should be fooled into thinking this discredits media critics' central point when it actually confirms it. Ideology and cultural changes have made reporters way too comfortable with insufficient journalism. This is a broken clock, being right twice a day. It's frustrating to watch people pile on media critics for criticizing the story when the criticism was warranted, and when many of those people taking a victory lap right now are missing the forest for the trees. The legacy media got Hunter Biden's laptop wrong, it got the Russia hoax wrong, it got Covington Catholic wrong, it got Jussie Smollett wrong, it got COVID wrong, and I could just keep on going. They won't ever admit it. They won't change or learn. They are peddling more disinformation than your weird cousin's Facebook feed. So don't let them use this example to discredit all of their critics, because that's exactly what they want, and it's exactly how they'll keep lowering their standards. So we have to repeat these awful national rigmaroles over and over, and that's not a deflection. I was wrong, I'll say it. But we can walk and we can chew gum at the same time, conceding what we got wrong without patting people on the back who don't deserve it. Ryan, I was thinking this morning that this mother has national news, international news, Telemundo, knocking on her door because the original story, if this original story had been corroborated, had said we reached out to law enforcement, et cetera, if it had done all of that, if they had waited to go to print before they heard back, I don't even know what their process was like with law enforcement, but we know that law enforcement had no voice in the story. That wouldn't happen. This family would still have their privacy. And instead, because the story ended up turning into this controversy because that original report was insufficient, it's frustrating, and I'm curious for your thoughts on it.
I mean, I think it is true that if the story had not been called into question, that the media probably would not have hunted down the family. But I also think that it's true that law enforcement wouldn't have been any help to the original Indy Star reporter, because the Attorney General of Ohio, the Washington Post, all of these different, media resources were put into trying to find somebody in Ohio on the law enforcement side who knew something about this story, and they came up empty. So but the reporter did have a direct firsthand source, the actual abortion care provider. And I feel like a lot of the conservative media kind of got thrown off the story because the way it was written in the Indy Star, it said the child ended up in Dr. Bernard's care.
Right.
And it's hard, I think. On the left, we were like, abortion care is health care. That's health care. They wound up in that person's care. That's an interview with the abortion provider. But I think on the right, because it's so caught up in separating it from health care, that it was hard for them to see. I'm curious if that was part of maybe your reading of the story too. You're like, no, we must be hearing from an activist here. We're not hearing directly, from the person. Now, I think that Indy Star reporter could have also tried to call the Ohio doctor who had made the referral. There are all types of HIPAA issues that are going to make that difficult, but that's certainly one that they could have tried. They could have tried to confirm with the mother. But I can understand from the reporter's perspective, they had the abortion provider, on the record, by name.
Well, so there's that, and that's absolutely true. But when you say into her care, that doesn't necessarily mean abortion. That's my reading of the situation was that's so open-ended. That could mean counseling. It could mean pre-abortion counseling. It could mean a lot of different things. It could mean that she actually never got there, because the way the story was worded was that it said off she went to Indiana to Bernard's care. I don't know that had actually happened yet. It actually, the way that it's worded is really vague. There's nothing that says they tried to contact law enforcement in the story. And on top of that there's a document that Politico got, which is the file Bernard had to give to Indiana to show that she had performed this abortion. And that's another thing that I would imagine and I would hope that the Indy Star had looked for or had tried to get any other corroboration. It's just, you cannot rely on a single source on stories that are this serious and this explosive. And I think you're right, it would have been really hard. Part of the reason the Washington Post called every single city in Ohio, they had actually reached out, Glenn Kessler reached out to the county office where the records ultimately were, and they didn't hear back from them. So I think it would have been extremely difficult, but that then becomes part of the story. You haven't been able to hear back from law enforcement, and you know that, both of us know that. You do put that in the story. So again, this isn't to deflect, because right away when the story came out, I was wrong to think it was likely false, but I said the reality here is that it does happen, and so there's no reason to deflect from that. It's absolutely true. It absolutely happens, and red state anti-abortion laws need to be completely clear about it. But at the same time, Gannett Papers need to do, that's the parent company. It owns a lot of local newspapers. I think this is a real lesson that an anecdote at the top of an Indianapolis Star story can get to the president, and it can spiral into something, and so it does need to be corroborated.
Right, and particularly with the lack of trust and with the mistakes that have been made, these reporters need to kind of show their work. And another thing you can do, if you can't get another source, what you can do is you can ask the provider herself, can you show us some calendar records, some emails, some documents that contemporaneously show this? Now, real quickly though, I wanted to look at the question of whether this was legal in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And so if you remember, when Roe was overturned, I talked about the cases of the two young women who died in Poland. Yes. Because they didn't move, the doctors didn't move fast enough on ectopic pregnancies. I don't remember all of the different details. They felt like the new Polish anti-abortion law barred them from performing the procedure that they needed to do to save this person's life. Hundreds of thousands of people, poured into the streets, threatening the stability of the government and pushing for reforms of the abortion law. The government's response was identical to this response, and I predicted that this would be what would happen. That you're going to have people die, and then after they die, you're going to have government officials say, well, actually, technically, if you look at this portion of the law, it's plausible that the doctor could have performed this life-saving procedure, and it might have been legal. Right. That okay, maybe that's all true. This could have, all the vagaries don't take into account the reality of the way that medicine is practiced in the United States. If they believe that there's a good chance that it's illegal, they're not going to do it. And if the Attorney General can't even say firmly, oh no, this was legal, then you're going to have doctors who are just not going to perform these procedures. And then separately, if you have shut down all of the clinics, it doesn't really help to say, well, we have a rape and incest exception for 10-year-olds. Totally. And the 10-year-old's like, great, I was raped by my uncle. Where can I go for this procedure? They're like, oh, well, there are no clinics left, because you can't keep clinics alive without, if it's just 10-year-old rape and incest victims. Like that's not enough services to perform. And so, there's nowhere for this to be performed. So legally, you would have been allowed to have this, but there's nobody who's able to perform it. And shutting all those clinics down, let's be honest, that's the goal of these laws and this movement.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all, and I don't disagree with the problems with the law whatsoever. But again, I think the Indy Star really needed to explain why this case study was a question of the law and get into that, and that actually makes for a better, more helpful story. Anyway, but to be clear, I agree. These laws need to be seriously thought about and seriously changed so that they are in these situations that they are just, and this is just an awful tragedy.
Right, and the right can look at it from a pragmatic perspective if that's better for them, because they will lose. Like you cannot kill little girls and have your policy remain in place. So if you want to keep this draconian anti-abortion thing going, you can't be so tough. You can't kill little girls. That's basically a rule of life.
You cannot be dismissive of the reality. And I think part of the right's reaction to the story was dismissive of the reality. No question about it. Ryan, I'm looking forward to what's on your radar next.